The rest of this afternoon is really just designed to set the stage for the rest of our time, both tonight and tomorrow. To start, Sam Abuelsamid from Guidehouse Insights is going to share his perspective, which he has titled Back to the Future, like the movie, A Brief History of Electrification. Sam's going to look back at how we got here and then look forward to where we're going. And then right after that, we're going to get into what we call the Fisita's President's Hour. We're going to hear from Kurt Kelty, who's my supervisor here at General Motors. He's VP of Battery Cell and Pack, and Paul Thomas, who is President of Bosch North America. After that, we're going to take a small break, let you network, kind of catch up on emails or whatever, before we're going to have a drinks reception, and then we'll have dinner and the Academy of Technical Leadership Awards. So without further ado, I would like to invite Sam to the stage and get the Fisita Summit underway.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you to Martin and Emma for inviting me to join you all here today. Looking forward to this for quite a while. There we go, sorry. My first visit to this campus was way back in 1988 when I was still a student at GMI, and I spent a couple of days in the research lab. My first exposure to this place was walking into the R&D building and walking up those circular stairs to the research lab. That was back before all of this stuff was online, and spent a couple of days digging for content for a project I was working on when I was working for GM of Canada. But in the years since then, I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time as an engineer, as an automotive journalist, some time doing PR, including a stint doing comms for technology communications for General Motors, and spending a lot of time in this building here. And for the last 10 years, I've been an analyst with Guidehouse Insights and Navigant Research in its prior iteration. As mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of electrification, where we are, where we're going, what needs to be done. You're all aware, of course, of the Benz motor wagon, widely regarded as the first automobile. But internal combustion was not an instant winner. Early on in the history of the automobile, we had a lot of different options, including electrification. Electrification was actually happened long before the Benz motor wagon. One of the very first was Robert Anderson in the 1830s, built an electric carriage. That one predated the idea of the rechargeable battery, so it wasn't very practical. But it was done, it worked, sort of. In 1888, we had the Flocken Electrowagon, which was one of the first to use some sort of rechargeable battery system. Again, still very early on. There was no clear winner as to what type of propulsion was going to dominate the auto industry for the next century and a half. And then, of course, Porsche, Ferdinand Porsche. You're all familiar with Porsche sports cars, but did you know that the first car that Ferdinand Porsche ever designed was an EV in 1899? Sorry about the typo on the slide here. That, again, not too terribly practical at the time, but he had some very interesting innovations, like some of the first hub motors. And then a couple of years later, the Lohner Porsche Mixed came out, and that was the first ever hybrid. It used an engine and batteries, and again with the hub motors. And some of these vehicles have been recreated, and if you ever visit the Porsche Museum in Stuttgart, they have recreations of these, including of those hub motors. EVs stuck around for several more decades. They did not immediately go away, in part because of fueling infrastructure or the absence of it to a large degree. We had cars like Detroit Edison and many others. And in fact, at the turn of the century, EVs were more popular than internal combustion vehicles. There were more EVs around. Partly because manual crank, if you had to turn the crank to start an engine, it wasn't very convenient. It was hard to get fuel for an internal combustion. They were noisy, they were slow. And EVs, even though they didn't have a whole lot of range in those days, eliminated most of those problems. You could charge them at home, and they were much smoother and quieter, and especially For women, they were much preferred to internal combustion vehicles. But even for men, everybody preferred them at the time. From the 1930s, for about the next 25 years, EVs sort of faded into the background. There wasn't a lot of them on the road, but they came back eventually. And starting in the 1960s in particular, they really started to make a comeback. General Motors in particular did a lot of work with electrification starting in the 1960s. 1966 was a very interesting year for electrification at GM because they had a couple of very important vehicles that they had built that year. Both concepts, neither of them went to production. One of them was the Electrovair, a four-door Corvair that was stuffed with silver zinc batteries and had an electric motor. The batteries were put anywhere where they could manage to fit them. This car actually, at least the last time I was aware of it, still existed in the GM Heritage Center up the road. But range was definitely an issue. One of the things that helped was getting the invention of the inverter that made AC motors more practical. And helped with the efficiency of electric propulsion. But you can see from the Electrovair 2, at lower speeds, speeds below about 20 miles an hour, you could get about 70 miles or so of range, but then it quickly dropped off down to about 40 miles, between 40 and 50 miles, up to top speeds of around 60 miles an hour. So still not very practical, and because of the size and weight of the batteries, nowhere to put cargo. So those silver zinc batteries that they used at the time were state of the art in that period in the mid 1960s, but they were still only good for about 60 to 100 charge cycles. Again, with the range, if they don't last very long, not very useful. The other big EV that GM built at that time was the Electrovan. Based on a Corvair van, and it used technology that was being developed for the Apollo program. This was the first ever fuel cell electric vehicle. And to the best of my knowledge, it was only actually ever driven one time here on this campus, over by the R&D Center. Not sure exactly at which side, which road, but it was reportedly only driven that one time. They tested it, proved it could work, and then they parked it and never did anything with that particular vehicle again. It, as far as I know, still resides in the Heritage Center. But it was the first vehicle with a hydrogen fuel cell system. Again, came out of the Apollo program. 32 kilowatt continuous output, 160 kilowatt peak. And fuel cell development continues at General Motors and a number of other companies to this day. GM has never entirely given up on the concept, and there's a lot of potential benefits to fuel cells, particularly for some market segments. Back in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of hope when batteries still hadn't made a lot of progress and were still very expensive, that maybe fuel cells would be the technology that would bring zero emissions transportation to the masses. Hasn't quite worked out that way. We never really got the development of the fueling infrastructure. Again, there's that problem again, fueling infrastructure. And if you don't get that, doesn't matter how cool the technology is, it's just not going to get anywhere. GM also built another electric vehicle in that time period, the Apollo Lunar Rover. 4 of them were built. 3 of them are still on the moon as of this day. They had range of about 22 miles, 8 mile an hour top speed, and they used those same similar silver zinc potassium hydroxide batteries from the Electrovair, and they were used by the astronauts on the final 3 Apollo missions to get further away from the lunar module and explore the surface of the moon a little bit more. Over the years, hobbyists and researchers continued to dabble in electrification. This particular example, when I was still working as an automotive journalist full-time, I was out in my yard one day mowing the lawn, and a gentleman pulled into my driveway. This was about 2009. In this Saturn coupe, And he had driven by my house many times and seen the different cars, the different press cars I was driving, and asked if I was an automotive journalist. I said, yeah. He said, do you mind if I show you my car? And he proceeds to tell me the story of this car. He had taken this Saturn Coupe and converted it to an EV. It was filled with lead acid batteries. He said it had a range of about 40-ish miles. He let me take it for a short drive, and it worked. Again, not entirely practical. Used up all of the trunk, all of the underhood space for these lead acid batteries. Still had a manual transmission. It had the original 5-speed manual hooked up to an electric motor driving the front wheels. But it just went to demonstrate that there was definitely still, even when EVs were not really a big thing yet, there was definitely interest in this that never really went away. But going back to 1990, actually 89, the modern EV really started to emerge. The GM Impact was introduced as a concept, and this car, after it got a really good public reception, Roger Smith, who was at that time the CEO and chairman of General Motors, announced that they would build a production run of at least 5,000 of these. And starting in 1990, development work began. It took a number of years before it finally did get to production as the EV1. During part of that time period, I was working at the Milford Proving Grounds, working for Delco Moraine, and some of my colleagues there were working on adapting the ABS-6 system that we had been introducing at that time to production to create a version of that that could be used for an electric rear braking system. So that one of the visions for the production version of this car was friction brakes on the front and fully electric brakes on the rear. Part of the development of all kinds of new technologies for this car. It took about 6 years before it finally made it to production as the EV1. It was surprisingly close to the original concept, at least in design, and a very advanced vehicle for its time. Still, at launch, it still had a lead acid battery, which gave it a pretty limited range of about 60 or 70 miles, maybe 80 miles, depending on conditions. It was eventually replaced in a second generation model with a nickel metal hydride battery that bumped up, that about doubled the range. But one of the challenges of this car is that almost everything in it was bespoke to this particular car. There were very few off-the-shelf components that were used in the EV1. And that was part of its ultimate demise. You've probably heard of the documentary film Who Killed the Electric Car. The EV1 was discontinued in 2003. GM decided they had not sold any of the vehicles to consumers. They leased them to consumers. And over that, at the end of that period, they pulled them all back from the drivers, many of whom were extremely disappointed. People really loved driving this thing. There was a lot of interesting stuff about it. It was, as a two-seater, it ultimately would have a limited market appeal, but it was a very advanced vehicle for its time. But because of all those bespoke components, it created a lot of challenges for GM in terms of trying to, it made it very expensive, for one thing, to manufacture. But it also posed support problems over the long haul. GM decided to bring them back, and most of them were crushed. Some of them had various proprietary components disabled and were donated to various research institutions and schools to be used for experimentation. But the vast majority of them, as you're no doubt aware, were destroyed. Probably the biggest problem with it was the way that the communications of it was handled in terms of why the program ended. But that wasn't the end of the line for the EV. Well, actually, before I get on that, a couple of the interesting technologies that emerged from the EV1 program, the charging system, this inductive charging paddle that was developed, was ultimately never used for any other programs. But it was very interesting from a usability and safety perspective. And then, of course, the T-shaped battery pack, which on the left, you see the EV1 pack. That same concept was ultimately also adopted for the Chevy Volt. battery pack. And around that time is when we start to see some other technologies starting to emerge and bridging the gap between internal combustion and pure battery electric. One of the most important ones was hybrids. Contrary to popular opinion, Toyota did not invent the hybrid. Of course, we saw the loaner Porsche from 1901, which was really the first hybrid. But in terms of the modern parallel split hybrid, that concept was actually invented by TRW in the late 1960s and patented by them. At that time, though, in the late 1960s, we didn't have a lot of the technologies that were needed to make it a practical option for production. We didn't have the electronic controls and various other components that we needed to really produce it. But it wasn't until 1997, when Toyota introduced the Prius, the first generation Prius, that the concept really became practical. And as of middle of this year, Toyota has sold over 33 million hybrid vehicles. And they continue, and they and many other manufacturers are continuing to sell hybrids at an increasingly rapid pace. Toyota now has hybrid options on virtually every vehicle they sell, and in many cases, many of the vehicles they sell are available only as hybrids, including the Prius, the latest generation Camry, and many others. But also around that same time, in the early 2000s, we had the rebirth of the modern EV. The T0 was the one that really set us off on another path. This was created by AC Propulsion based on a kit car chassis, and it was stuffed full of lithium-ion batteries and 18650 cells, which may be familiar. That concept, that vehicle, was driven by a number of different people, including Martin Eberhard and his partner Mark Tarpenning, and also people like J.B. Straubel and Elon Musk. Martin and Mark decided to start a car company. They couldn't convince AC Propulsion to build a production version of this vehicle. They wanted something like that, and thus Tesla was born in 2003 as well. They took the ideas of the T0, got a chassis from Lotus, a heavily modified version of the Elise chassis, and then later on, after about 9 months after forming the company, got some funding from Mr. Musk, and began development of the original Tesla Roadster. It used a modified Elise chassis, a lithium-ion battery. It was comprised of over 4,000 18650 cells, had a range of over 200 miles, and a 0 to 60 time of about 4 seconds. That production versions finally hit the road in 2008, and it was produced until 2012. But the beginning of the EV really going mainstream was the Nissan Leaf. That car was designed to be a practical alternative for the average consumer at not too crazy price point, a lot cheaper than the Tesla Roadster was. It was still $40,000 to start, which was for a compact hatchback, still pretty pricey, and it only had about 75 miles of range, although later variants that they build today can get over 200 miles. Through the first part of the 2010s, this was the top-selling EV in the world. But again, still that 75-mile range, for a lot of people, that was just a non-starter. And so in this building here, a number of people got together and conceived the idea of the extended range EV, which, like many other ideas that have been conceived on this campus, was maybe a little bit ahead of its time. The original Chevy Volt concept shown at the January 2007 Detroit show was the first, what we now think of as a range extended EV, where the engine was there only to drive a generator to keep the battery charged once the charge was depleted. It featured a 16 kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery pack. The original concept was spec'd with about a 40-mile range. The production version that came out in 2010, about the same time as the Leaf, ended up being about, I think it was 35 or 36 miles on the EPA tests, but could, in many cases, get over 40 miles of range. But it brought that idea of the extended range EV to production. While the production version, because of financial and resource limitations here at GM in that period, ended up being a heavily modified version of the two-mode hybrid system. It still mostly functioned in the way that it was originally conceived as an EREV. And those EREVs are now starting to come back into the marketplace. There's a lot of them on sale in China. We're going to start getting them here in the U.S. again next year with a version of the Ram 1500, and I expect to see quite a few more over the next several years. But the real breakthrough when it came to EVs, modern EVs, was the Tesla Model S, because this was, unlike the Roadster, was built from scratch, from the ground up as an EV, and in many ways it's the first really modern 21st century car. It's an EV that, depending on the battery size, can have a range approaching 300 miles. It was a 5-seater, practical, a hatchback. It had a modern EE architecture that enabled over-the-air software updates. It brought us the first DC fast charging network with the supercharger network, and there were versions of it that could be had at a price point approaching $50,000 after incentives. And so it was real, as I said, really the first modern 21st century automobile. And a lot of the concepts that we first saw in this car have proliferated throughout the market, including a lot of vehicles that we see from General Motors and pretty much every other automaker today. Hydrogen is still hanging in there. It's still part of the picture. Back in the spring of 2007, I was invited by General Motors to join on a drive with their sequel concepts, which was intended to demonstrate the viability of fuel cell vehicles by being the first drive of a fuel cell vehicle to go over 300 miles on a single fill-up of fuel. And we drove those cars from Honey Eye Falls to White Plains here over the course of a day, and proved that it was capable. Today, most of the focus around fuel cells, at least for ground transportation, while there are a couple of fuel cell vehicles like the Toyota Mirai and a few others, most of the focus now has turned to large, heavy-duty vehicles like this Nikola tractor trailer. Batteries, throughout this whole period, have been in a constant state of evolution. That hybrid Prius used the nickel metal hydride batteries that have been used in many hybrids over the years. It was also, as I said, used in that second generation of the EV1. It had 2 to 3 times the energy density and charge cycle life of lead acid batteries. It was relatively affordable. It's still commonly used today in many hybrids. But as we got into EVs, it was all about the cells, getting as many cells in there as you can. With the Model S, Tesla retained the 18650 cylindrical cell format. The Model S battery pack, the longest range versions of it, had over 8,000 cells in there, arranged in modules and all wired together. Pretty complex, actually. But even today, we're seeing use of multiple cell formats. Cylindrical cells are still very popular because of their cost. They're less expensive to manufacture than prismatic or pouch cells. Pouch cells and prismatic cells are also very widely used. Larger format cells that require fewer parts, fewer connections in the battery pack than the cylindrical cells. But we're seeing the cylindrical cells grow in size over time as well. Tesla introduced the 2170 cell, 21 millimeter diameter, 70 millimeter long, and more recently a 4680. And that 46 millimeter cylindrical cell is a real interesting format. It's starting to become much more popular with a lot of manufacturers. Rivian just announced last week that they are going to be getting 4695 cells from LG starting in 2026. And the 46 millimeter seems to be the sweet spot in terms of one of the advantages of the prismatic and pouch cells is that you don't have to have as much void space in between them. When you pack in cylinders together, there's always space in between those cylinders. And so there's some lost volume in the battery pack. 46 millimeter cylindrical kind of hits the sweet spot of maximizing the amount of active cell material, active cathode material in the battery pack and balancing off the void size so you get the maximum amount of energy density into a battery pack. Also, still a lot of variety in chemistries. Most of the EVs today are using either LFP, especially in China, where it's the dominant chemistry, but various nickel cobalt chemistries, particularly NMC and NMCA, are dominant in much of the rest of the world because they do have higher energy density, although they are more expensive, have some potential challenges with thermal runaway. But they all have different properties, and so manufacturers are looking at different chemistries for different use cases and trying to get the right balance between those. Also seeing changes in pack architectures, moving away from the modular packs that were originally popular when we didn't know how reliable the batteries were going to be, how durable they were going to be. We now see that they're better than we expected in terms of their life cycle, and also in terms of safety aspects, and especially with LFP, moving towards cell to pack or even cell to vehicle type architectures. BYD's blades, the CATL Qilin cells, both large format prismatic LFP cells that they just pack in there and go from about typical 35% active fill ratio on with the modular battery packs to 75% or more of the volume of a battery pack being active cell material with some of these cell to pack designs. Also getting into solid state cells. And I was asked earlier by a couple of people when we're going to start to see this. Today's cells primarily are a cathode, anode, separator, and a liquid electrolyte in the package. And everybody is trying to get to solid state for better safety, better durability, higher energy density. And we're slowly getting there. And by the end of the decade, we should start to see some solid state cell in volume production. We're also getting things like lithium metal, solid state lithium metal cells. And we've got someone here from Cyan Energy or Cyan Power. They're one of the companies working on lithium metal chemistries. So a lot of interesting advances coming along with cells. Also on the refueling side, and with gas vehicles or internal combustion vehicles, we've got standardized nozzles and filler necks on cars, but we're now starting to consolidate a little bit more on the different charging connectors. Certainly here in North America, with the SAE J3400 standard, we're starting to adopt that, and some of the first non-Tesla vehicles with the J3400 connector are in production now. The 2025 Hyundai Ioniq 5 and EV6 will have that. The new Lucid Gravity that's launching in the next few weeks will have these, and we're going to see more and more of those, although we still have different connectors in other parts of the world. We're also moving towards perhaps skipping the wire entirely with wireless power transfer. It's still more costly than conductive charging, but we've got progress being made. But we also need a lot of progress on making the charging more reliable. It's got to be as reliable as fuel pumps, and today it's still not, especially on the CCS, among the CCS charging providers. They are still doing a pretty miserable job. They need to get much better if people are going to trust that they can buy an EV and be able to charge it when they need to charge it. But there's lots of investment in better facilities. We've got the Iona joint venture that is working on its first couple of charging stations right now, and we'll have, I think the first ones will be opening in the next month or so. GM and their partnership with EVgo doing chargers both at places like grocery stores, but also their partnership with Flying J to do highway chargers with features like canopies and various other amenities that people would want to use when their car is sitting there for anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour to charge. But also, DC charging by itself is not going to be enough. We need to have more curbside charging. People need to be able to charge wherever they park their car. This past weekend, I was in Denver visiting our daughter, and in Denver, in many of the neighborhoods, you've got scenes like this where you've got single-family homes that are side by side. Nobody's got a driveway or a parking lot. That's not an uncommon scenario in many older urban neighborhoods, and everyone has to park curbside, so they don't have an option to charge at home. in the traditional sense. So we need to have charging infrastructure, and the SAE J3400 standard will help with that by including support for 277 volt charging, which will make it easier to do things like these curbside pedestals where you just bring your own cord, plug it in, or plugging into utility poles and light poles. I want to wrap up now. I'm already way over time here, but there's been a lot of talk about BEV sales slowing down. Not entirely true. The growth rates are slowing down, which is going to be inherent as the volumes increase. Especially because what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years is a pretty steady linear growth of EV sales in North America, and so we haven't hit a hockey stick yet. But as you can see from the top chart up here, this is BEV sales over the last 3 years. We did have a drop at the beginning of this year when a number of vehicles lost their eligibility for IRA tax credits. That has restored. Sales are back on track. We are on track to have our best BEV sales year ever in the United States this year. But in addition to growth, we're also seeing more diversity in the market, more players offering a wider range of BEVs at a wider range of price points, and that is part of what's helping, is addressing the affordability challenge. And you can see, for example, the bottom chart here, market share. Tesla's market share has declined from about 80% of the BEV market in 2020 to now under 50%. But we've got a lot of growth from almost every other manufacturer that's taking that up and growing the market as a whole. Where are we headed? We're going to continue to have a lot of diversity in our propulsion systems over the next decade. We're going to see pure ICE vehicles continuing to gradually decline, but a lot of that decline is going to be picked up by hybrids, by plug-in hybrids, and especially by BEVs. We believe our forecast at Guidehouse is that we will continue to see growth in BEVs, getting to above 40% by the early 2030s of the total market, and much of the rest of the market being electrified in some form. And that is all I have, and since I'm 5 minutes over already, I'll be around if anybody wants to ask me any questions.